Dr. Radin, it is truly an honor to have you with me on Transcendence. For more than 4 decades, you have explored areas of human experience that sit at the edge of scientific orthodoxy, psi phenomena, the mechanics of magic, and the deeper forces through which consciousness interacts with the physical world. In studying your work for today's conversation, including a second pass through the science of magic, completing it again yesterday, I'm struck by your ability to bring clarity and rigor to topics that many avoid, and to show that what we call magic may in fact be the mind's natural ability to interact with the fabric of reality in lawful, measurable ways, although one must cultivate this capacity. Today, I hope we can explore not just the science behind psi, but also what these findings imply about human potential, the architecture of consciousness, and the possibility that mind is far more entangled with the world than we've been taught to believe. Thank you for being here and welcome to On Transcendence.
My pleasure.
You spent decades examining psi phenomena, areas many scientists, as I mentioned in the intro, avoid. What first led you to take psi and the underlying mechanics of magic seriously as a series of scientific topics?
What led me was curiosity.
Mm.
So if you're a child and you read Harry Potter, it's of course the fantasy element of it is attractive.
Mhm.
Uh, Children are adept at magical thinking,
Mhm.
and so some part of me has never grown up, like Peter
Mhm.
Pan. So I always wondered about fairy tales and then later science fiction and then later stories about the mystic masters of the East and the West and magic and all of that.
Mhm.
And while, of course, you go through an educational program, you realize, yeah, that's stories, there are elaborations, there are parables and so on. But part of me always wondered if any of that was true. And this
Mhm.
partially comes out of an interest also in metaphor and in mythology, where stories are spun, and it's clearly a story, but the reason why people are attracted to the story is because it does have underlying truth,
Mhm.
whether
Mhm.
it's a mythological story or something else. And so we kept having this thought, uh, could this be true? And so since I started a scientific career path, I decided, well, I can do these experiments too. And so I started to do them, and I learned that, oh, those things I've been reading about in parapsychology, some of that stuff is repeatable, and I can see it myself. So
Mhm.
that really was the hook. That transitioned from, I wonder if, fill in the blank, to, oh, like this stuff you can actually see in your own laboratory under your own conditions. That's what convinced me.
From what did you pivot in terms of what you did before getting into psi research?
Well, I started doing actual experiments in graduate school
Mhm.
as just for fun.
Mhm.
Uh, the thing that convinced me that if it was possible to spend a career doing this, that's what I wanted to do,
Mhm.
was I was working at Bell Laboratories at the time. Uh, I had the opportunity to travel and to visit people who were involved in parapsychology, so I was able to see firsthand the people and what they were doing. And one of those individuals was Helmut Schmidt, who had been a physicist at Boeing Aerospace before he got into parapsychology. And he developed the first random number generator, a true randomness system as a target for mind-matter interaction.
Mhm.
And so he kindly loaned me one of the machines that he made, which was based on radioactive decay latencies. And to make a long story short, the task of the person involved in the experiment was to try to either increase or decrease the rate of radioactive decay, purely
Mhm.
mentally,
Mhm.
which should be impossible by any conventional reasoning. But nevertheless, I ended up doing something like 20 experiments, and the overall results were odds against chance of 20,000 to 1.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, so now I was stuck. Like, what do we do with this? Because, if you actually see something like that happen and you know it's not chance and you know you did it and you inspected the machine really carefully, and it wasn't just me as the participant, I had other people at Bell Labs that were doing this. Well, I eventually got permission to present that and other experiments I had been doing at a conference. And what cemented it all was I was recruited into what is now known as the Stargate program, which was on psychic espionage, classified program.
Hmm.
So in that program, it went from interesting statistical effects, which is still interesting when you know how to appreciate statistics, to very talented people who are doing remote viewing for espionage, for real military and intelligence missions. And those people just blew me out of the water because they're
Hmm.
able to do things at a level of accuracy and on demand
Hmm.
that I don't think I even read about such people. Like, is that really real? Well, yeah, I was meeting them and I was able to witness that they were able to do this. So it was that experience that taught me I need to figure out a way of manifesting a career track that doesn't exist to allow me to work as a scientist for basically as long as I can manage to keep doing the work. And so here I am some 40 years later, and I've been employed full time as a scientist looking into these kinds of phenomena.
Now, with your feet in both worlds initially, that of the world of research and academia, where people may not, colleagues may not believe this is real, and then being recruited to the program for Stargate, classified at the time, now declassified, based on what I was reading in your work. What was it like for you to be in sessions and share with people your research and them saying, "Oh, well, that doesn't exist," and yet you have a direct experience of knowing that it does exist? How do you navigate worlds such as that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, so one of the things I've noticed in speaking to technical audiences in particular, the general population already is on board. They don't need to be convinced.
Mhm.
Technical audiences uh, have a kind of a social contract, and you see this in both in academia and in industry, that you don't talk about this stuff. It's like Fight Club. You don't talk about Fight Club. You don't talk about your experiences. Privately, it's a completely different issue. If it's a private forum, or especially a one-on-one private, then I get here's psychic stories from everybody
Mhm.
constantly. But in a technical audience, there's some reluctance to speak up. And there's always about 20 to 30% who are just crazy skeptical.
Mhm.
They don't believe anything.
Mhm.
But that leaves 70% typically that are completely on board. And I can tell because they're doing things like you're doing. They're nodding as I'm saying, did anyone ever have this experience? And they're kind of nodding and looking around to make sure nobody's watching.
Mhm.
But that's the majority of the audience, even in technical environments and in the military and in industry and everywhere. So I'm talking to the mainstream. So the fact that there are some people get very emotional, that their ideology is somehow being attacked, and they will be vocal about it, my reaction to it is, oh well, it's par for the course when you're pushing the status quo, especially because I knew that the actual status quo was heavily on my side. They just didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It makes you think about Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, where he talks about it's science advancing, one retirement at a time. And when I read that years ago, my first thought was, I think he's referring to people transitioning to the realm beyond, and that being able to then be advanced, a new idea, a new way of thinking, new way of being. And I'd since learned from another colleague, John Hagelin, he would often say one funeral at a time that science advances. And it's really sad because I look at what we can achieve just in my own now 17 years of practicing TM, Transcendental Meditation directly, teaching it now, my wife, 13 years coming up, teaching it and seeing the effects both that it had on us when we began the practice and now teaching it almost 13 years, what it has done for those with whom we've worked. So we know what it does. And then I go back to 1993 when I encountered a person who caused me to commit to securing a particular book for study. And I noted my own experiences. So I've been at this now for over 30 years of noting what can happen and then being in academic settings and encountering those who resist this information for various reasons. And some, it comes down to grants and funding and being able to publish articles and the like. While I understand that, I recognize that we are at, especially now, at a point in human history where it seems as if nature is pushing us, some of us tooth and nail, kicking and screaming, if you will, to advance these ideas much more easily, much more readily. As Fred Travis would often say, that we need to have packets of knowledge out here. And these packets of knowledge come to serve as points of reference for those who interface with them, such that the packet of knowledge that you create that may be a micro insight might very well be the straw that breaks the camel's back to push them into the other corner. And as a result of that, you then reach this tipping point where, as a society, we move in this direction. I think about the shifting of the ages throughout time.
Sure.
And what do you see, in addition to your research and that of others and your colleagues, as being not only the holdup, what more can we do to advance this knowledge and make sure more people have access to it, even those who are critically skeptical of what the research says and even the direct experiences of people such as yourself and myself?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I wrote my most recent book on the science of magic was to point out that we have been in the midst of a paradigm change for some time, for
Mhm.
maybe 30 years.
Mhm.
And my last book was called Real Magic, which I actually wrote in 2017, but it came out in 2018.
Mhm.
I was mentioning that it looks like something is happening, like things are changing, but
Mhm.
because we are over the knee of the curve now, that there's so many people who are mainstream thought leaders in many different disciplines who are coming around not immediately saying all the psychic stuff is real,
Mhm.
but they're taking the next step, which is very important, which is saying maybe we should take another look at the philosophy of science. And so the philosophy of science that has driven it for the last 500 years is materialism. It's the
Mhm.
idea that basically all there is matter and energy, or first matter, and then after Einstein, also energy.
Mhm.
And now people are seriously reconsidering ideas like idealism, like
Mhm.
everything is really just consciousness, or
Mhm.
dual aspect monism, or panpsychism, or a bunch of other things which are different than, more expansive than purely just materialism. The other thing is that when you look at actual advancements in quantum mechanics, the meaning of material has radically changed
Yes.
since around 1900. I mean, it is so different that if you ask somebody in 1900, about non-locality, about observer effects, about all the rest of the strangeness of quantum mechanics, they would have thought you were insane. The direction of the insanity is pointing like further down the line. Don't look at my hand or where I'm pointing, look that way. It's pointing towards something like a science of magic.
Mhm.
And we use magic only because it's a placeholder term. We don't know what else to call it right now.
Mhm.
But something having to do with the relationship of the mind to the physical world. That's where we're going. And we're going there faster and faster as time goes by. And I think that AI will continue to accelerate it.
I have to agree with you on AI, and having read both Real Magic and The Science of Magic, I must say, making my way through both of them, and then of course, Supernormal and Entangled Minds, you highlight the history of the research. You highlight how just simply fascinating the numbers are, and how even with the high bar that has been set within the academic disciplines in terms of scientific research, that at every step of the way, you've met it. And other researchers have met it, yet there's still this pushback. And so I like the fact that you mentioned idealism. I'm going back to Science of Magic here, and how it's time to re-examine panpsychism. It's time to re-examine idealism, because as we know, I look back to, some of the earlier writers and thinkers that talked about consciousness being fundamental. I go back to Max Planck. I go back to Wigner. I go back to, Einstein, and I see them talking about this. I go back to even Newton, who himself was, he himself was a mystic. You go back to his journals and you read through, like, it's like, wait a second, these are people that are thought of in temporary contemporary terms as hardcore scientists, but they had this other side as well. They were engaging in this critical inquiry that said, behind this thing called matter, there's something else. And what is that
Right.
something else? That to me is fascinating. And I go back to, for example, your research on chocolate and how you had the monks, you sought to determine whether or not people consuming chocolate, if this chocolate was blessed, that it could produce a measurable effect in the person who consumed the chocolate. Share with us how that research came about and your findings on it, because that was very fascinating for me. I think the listeners would love to hear that.
Well, so this idea was proposed by a person who owns a chocolate, um, what is it, a plantation or something? I don't know what
Mm,
the term is, but he
mm,
owned a place where they grew the cocoa beans for
mhm,
chocolate. Um, and he had said that he noticed just from being somebody who pays attention at restaurants that if the people preparing the food are all happy and coordinated and everything, the food is somehow better
mhm,
than if everyone's angry in the kitchen.
mhm, mhm,
So he said, well, maybe we could do this with chocolate since people like to have chocolate anyway, and it's a mood elevator. Maybe we could push the mood elevation even farther if we have it blessed by people who know how to do such things,
mhm,
with the particular blessing of it will accelerate people's mood. It'll enhance mood even more. So we thought, okay, we'll do a double-blind test, a standard controlled randomized trial where we recruited people, we gave half of them non-blessed chocolate from the same source as the
mhm,
blessed chocolate. So a single source and then blessed or not blessed. They knew the nature of the test and they were asked to record their mood every day over the course of a week. 3 middle days of the week, they actually ate the chocolate and they were told, you have to eat it at 10 a.m. and then at 3 p.m. And at the end of the day, record your mood. When you do a typical controlled randomized trial, it's not that easy to recruit people. In this
mhm,
case, they were banging down the door because this test required that you eat a gourmet brand of chocolate at specific times. And so it was easy to recruit people. We had to turn people away. So the measurement was a standardized mood reporting scale and basically get the data at the end of it. And the double blinds was that the people eating the chocolate didn't know what they were eating, blessed or
mhm,
non-blessed, and the
mhm,
statistician didn't know which of these two groups because he had all of the data now, which is which. So I was the statistician, so I got the data back, but it was coded in a way that I couldn't tell which
mhm,
group had the blessed versus not blessed. So we analyzed it in the usual way that you would for any kind of clinical trial, and it showed that one group actually had improved mood, and that
mhm,
turned out to be the one having the blessed chocolate.
mhm,
So I thought that was interesting. Sort of, it's like many of the experiments that we do that you hear something that people talk about. In this case, my wife happens to be a chef and was a chef in gourmet restaurants for many years. And she noticed also that there's something about the intention of the chef and also the kitchen environment that seems to translate itself into the food because people then are more complimentary about what they just had. And so, okay, there's an experience. Let's see if we can operationalize that into an experiment and see if we can get it under controlled conditions. And in this case, the answer was yes. That's what we saw.
Well, it's fascinating because when I read that in the book, both in Science and Magic and one of your other works about the chocolate, my mind immediately went to a pretty well-known movie from the 90s, early 90s, early to mid 90s called Like Water for Chocolate. And the story, for those who've not seen it, is that this gentleman, he wants to marry this daughter. And the mom says, no, you can't marry this daughter, but you can marry the other daughter. And he decides to marry the other daughter so he could be near the woman whom he really loved. And as a result of making that decision, there was a lot of heartache because the woman could not be with him and she couldn't be, and a bunch of other stuff happens. But most importantly, not just the love story, but it was that when the woman who was sad, when she's making food, her emotions were transmitted to the food itself. So much so that if she was having a really bad day and she was crying when she was making the food. The food looked sumptuous on the screen, but as people were consuming the food, they were also transmitting her emotions through themselves as well as a result of food that they consumed. That
She
was
created,
fascinating movie. And so when I
yeah.
read that in your book about the chocolate, I immediately thought about like Water for Chocolate. And it's a phenomenal movie for those who haven't seen it. And I highly recommend it because again, you have these moments of your wife mentioning being a chef and her experiences. My own experiences, I was an undergrad making food for a departmental meeting, and I made pineapple coconut 7-Up cake and some jambalaya. And the then chair of the department said to me, "You are a Renaissance man. You have both the scholarly aspect and you can also cook and you're athletic and a bunch of other stuff." And I had to chuckle because my food that I brought, the cake and the jambalaya, big pot of jambalaya, both were gone rather quickly from the potluck. Other people's food remained. And so for me, it highlights how we are living in this thing that we've created. In one of my models, I refer to it as this human-derived world, the world that we create within the phenomenal world, of which we are a part of that phenomenal world. And so you create this human-derived world. We have our constructs and our outcomes, and oftentimes our outcomes privilege some and disadvantage others. But we've created all of that. And within all of that, the universe itself is governed by what I refer to as simply pure consciousness. And we're born into the world. We are part of it. We're not apart from it. And so, based on what I'm observing in your work, specifically real magic and science of magic, is that, and even in entangled minds to a large extent, that we've never not been a part from, but are a part of. And as a result of that, all of the laws that govern the entirety of the universe are within us. And so it stands to reason that we have certain capacities that we haven't been told of from our socialization, but that are nonetheless there. And as a result of that, if we tap into it, we can then, based on your research and others, begin to quantify it and understand it, and just maybe move the ball down the field a bit more for our collective understanding of possibility, as opposed to being something being thought of as impossible, because it comes back to us as humans. And
Mhm.
so, one of the questions I have for you, in the real magic and the science of magic, you frame magic as the mind's natural ability to influence physical systems, going back to the food. Now, so how would you define magic scientifically, and what are some of the misconceptions that most people have that ultimately obscure this reality?
Well, I like the phrase that physicist John Wheeler used, in that we live in a participatory universe.
Mhm.
And so when you start looking deeply at what quantum mechanics, which is the most successful physical theory that we have that ever developed, it has a very strange characteristic in it, in that there's something about measurement which is not yet resolved in quantum
Mhm.
mechanics. That you, when you measure a quantum particle, it gains properties that it had like an infinite number of properties beforehand, and now you measure it and it has one property. And so that's the so-called collapse of the wave function. The wave function is an infinite number of possibilities, actually not even probabilities, but possibilities that transition somehow into the actual world that we see. And
Mhm.
so this is one of the reasons why Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics very much, because you want a physical theory to tell you what is actually happening. Quantum mechanics doesn't tell us what's happening, and it's missing a couple of important things, like how did it turn from an infinite number of possibilities into the thing that I see? So there are suggestions that things like decoherence, that
Mhm.
a quantum particle interacts with the rest of the universe, it destroys the coherence, which creates
Mhm.
the quantum strangeness. But that doesn't make the quantumness go away.
Mhm.
It doesn't select that this outcome is going to happen versus that. So many physicists have been dealing with this issue for a long time, and especially in the from the 1920s to 1950s. And many concluded that there was something that had to be non-physical in order to make the transition then from this
Mhm.
quantum cloud of possibilities into the world that we experience. And so, what do we know that's non-physical? The suggestion was there's something about experience, about subjective experience, namely awareness, like pure
Mhm.
awareness. does not seem to be physical. It's like looking at the world from the inside as opposed
Mm,
to looking at it from the outside. So science is really good at looking at things from the outside, but it doesn't get the inside state. And so from that perspective, all of everything that we do in Psi research is kind of pointing again at that issue. Does consciousness actually interact with the physical world in some way?
mm,
And so if it does, then the idea of magic is very straightforward because that is what magic's about, whether it's enchantment or divination or one of the other methods, that it's all about the notion of we are participating, that we're
mm,
not simply participating passively, but actively in the way that the world actually is shaped. And so it's not much of a step to get from that notion, which again, prominent physicists have proposed this as a way of thinking about what's going on. That idea that we're participating with physical reality is that close to
mm,
magical ideas of manifestation.
mhm.
Like, I want a certain outcome to occur. If I am participating with the universe, and maybe my intention shapes the way things are. And what our experiments say is, yeah, we even see that in the laboratory. And
Mm.
it's not like watching a superhero movie. It's not at that level. It's a small effect, but it's a measurable effect. And so
Agreed.
it looks like the traditional ideas of magic are actually true.
Yeah. To your point on that, I like how you said it's 2 points here. You said the paranormal is our secret in plain sight. I love that one. And that psi itself is the human experience of the entangled universe. Those two lines jumped out at me as I was making my way through your works. And so as we begin to think about that we are living in this entangled universe, that we do have an impact on not just food, but one another. This gets into your research in terms of random number generators and 9/11, which I was the woman who was in the plane several hours before that occurred, and then to see what occurred there. I look at it and how you got into working with the random number generators and looking at New Year's Eve in particular, taking a look at how things shifted with New Year's Eve and taking a look at each of the subsequent months to understand if there was a measurable effect and noting that, okay, there's something happening here. So, in what other ways have you employed RNGs and what is the history? You mentioned at the outset RNGs, but what additional ways have you seen RNG used and have you used them yourself in your research?
Well, I've lost count of how many studies using random generators that I've done.
Mhm.
Uh, One that I don't recall whether I mentioned this in the book or not was that my colleagues and I, and we as well, have noticed that during healing sessions
Mm,
involving psychic healers, Reiki healers, therapeutic touch, you name it, like the whole gamut of non-contact healers. So
mhm,
they may have a client near them, but they're not touching them.
mhm,
Then it becomes a different kind of therapy. But in these distant healing or non-contact healing, it involves some intention on the part of the healer. So we thought, well, since we see already that focused attention and intention make a difference, it seems
mhm,
to organize the world in some way. Let's run sessions where we have these random number generators going. And
mhm,
so, as I said, we have done this and colleagues have done this, and we see that during healing sessions, randomness decreases. Or to put it another way, there's something about in the environment seems to become more coherent and more orderly. And that's reflected then in the statistics of the random number generators. We think there's nothing magical about the random number generator, it just happens to be a convenient tool for measuring these kinds of things. So So that's one area. I mean, then there's so many other uses of random number generators in for experimental purposes. And what I'm discussing with now is the possibility of developing games, like using
mhm,
Roblox and other
mhm,
games which are incredibly popular,
mhm,
to make psi-oriented games where I mean, if you have an adventure game, for example, you can introduce elements of magic in the game that require that a random number generator behaves in a certain way in order for a piece of magic to work in the game. or to make the right
Fascinating.
decision, or to have the key for a door to open, or all kinds of things like that. And then we would embed psi tasks inside the game. And people may or may not know that. I don't even know if we would want to tell them that it has
Hmm.
that. But it would give the notion of, like, my wife and I play a virtual golf game
Hmm.
almost every night in VR. And so when you hit the ball, you automatically start feeling you provide English to the ball, so-called, and you want to push it mentally, go there. Well, if you had something in the game that allowed that kind of intentional push to actually do something, well, we'd use a random number generator. And if it happens to go in one direction versus the other, you can provide this intentional push. So that's
Mm.
something that we're in discussions with. And I've created an experiment that will use an adventure theme to to have the person who's in the adventure try to make a candle flame get smaller and
Yes.
eventually put it out if
Mhm.
possible. And if that were possible, that actually is then linked back into an interference system, an
Mm.
optical interference system, as a way of us testing the role of consciousness in the double slit system. I'm using actually a
Mm.
slightly different system, but it's the same idea.
Hmm.
Does your does your ability to influence or gain knowledge out of a quantum system,
Mm.
which for your perspective, you're on a website and you're just looking at a candle flame, but if you have the ability for your intention to move that, you would be influencing what's going on with photons inside an interferometer.
For those who would want to perhaps pause this interview and visit your website to take a look at what you offer, what is your URL for your website?
Well, my personal website is deanradin.com,
Hmm.
all one word. And my professional is noetic.org, noetic.org. And I'm also chairman of a biotech company called cognigenics.io. So I have lots of hats.
In the science of magic, you explore esoteric traditions, indigenous knowledge, and experimental science. Where do you see these streams converging, and what might a unified framework of consciousness and psi look like for you moving forward?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk at Harvard, where we met,
Hmm.
um, if you look at spiritual traditions, you find virtually all of them that I've been able to find say that you eventually, through the practice, whether it's meditation or some other technique, you bump into psychic abilities.
Yeah.
And they have different names. So they're the siddhis and the karamats and on and on. All of the traditions have the same thing. So that provides an immediate clue that there is something that there's an inherent ability that most people have. Some will have it more than others because we're talented in various things. But nevertheless, I think by virtue of being sentient and being willing to do
Mm.
some kind of a mental practice, that you begin to expand the capabilities that are inherently there. And you will probably initially start to experience synchronicities, and then you'll experience things like precognition and maybe retrocognition. And the further down you go, the more and more complex the experiences will become. That's a clue. The fact that you see it across cultures throughout history, and we've been able to take some of those ideas and actually test it in the laboratory, strongly suggests that the concept within
Mm.
spiritual traditions, almost all of them, they're not fantasies.
Yeah.
Now, I make a distinction between organized religion. You start with mystical experience, you create an esoteric lineage through that. It becomes formalized and then turns into dogma pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking about the raw experiential side of it, not the religious side.
I saw something recently that said that Yeshua or Jesus, he wasn't a Christian, and you know, he that came after. Christianity came after,
Yeah,
and he was
he was
more
Jewish,
he was Jewish, and he was more in line with Jewish mysticism than anything.
right?
And that is something that people often forget. I saw something that said Christianity is a story about Jesus, not of Jesus, which I thought was really powerful distinction between the two, and saying that when you realize that he'd had these experiences, because again, he went into for 40 days and for 40 nights, he prayed. And so, and I say to people, well, when they say, well, how different is meditation and prayer? And I say, prayer is talking to God, meditation is listening to God. And when
Hmm.
I understood the differences, you begin to recognize that the meditation is moving that attention in an inward direction to begin to recognize the expansiveness of who and what we are and from what we become and how we've become, and to allow us to kind of going back and reverse engineering this process of how we became who and what we are, and then see where the blips along the way occurred and can then correct those, which brings up the next question regarding retrocausal effects. And so I want to talk about that retrocausality and have you talk about the research in that respect as well, please.
Yeah, this is the part that makes your brain hurt
Hmm.
because we're so used in the everyday world for ordinary clock time that,
Hmm.
that our sense is, well, of course, time is always moving in one direction, that everything is reminding us of that all the time. But when you look at the equations of classical and quantum mechanics, you see that most of them are either time symmetric or the variable of time doesn't even show up at all. And so at least from if we are paying attention to the equations for all the other things that we use quantum mechanics for, well, why are we not paying attention to that? Because in the
Hmm.
quantum world, it is said that if you happen to be a quantum particle, that you're influenced certainly by the past, but you're also influenced by your future. So the
Hmm.
present, past, and future are also somehow mashed together at the same time. And it's, as you can see, it's difficult to even talk about this stuff without using the notion of time.
Hmm.
So there was a prediction made in the 1950s, I believe, that were formalized into experiments using random number generators. And the way it would work is if observation actually does so-called collapse the quantum wave function, and that transitions this infinite possibility space into the world that we actually experience, and you need consciousness to do that, then why don't we take random number generators, record a whole bunch of bits, but nobody
Hmm.
pays any attention to it.
Yes.
So it's on a computer somewhere, but no one knows what they are. And then later you play back those random bits into some kind of a task. And that at that time, when you're playing the bits back, you give instructions as to whether you want more 1 bits, more 0 bits, or however it is. So you give instructions at that time to manipulate the bits. Well, those experiments work.
Hmm.
And it's strange because the bits were already recorded in the past, but they're being influenced from the future. It works just as well as doing it in real time.
Hmm.
And that is suggesting that there is some kind of a diving down of consciousness, as a metaphorical way of thinking of it. You dive down into a quantum space where time doesn't exist in the way that
Exists.
we experience it, that it's like all there all the time. That's simply the way it is. From our experiential point of view, we are not changing the past because if the past were already known, it would mean that at that point it was collapsed, so-called, and then you can't collapse it anymore. But if it's not known, it remains in a superposition of possibilities. When you finally do see the results, you're seeing bits being played back from the past, then you have an opportunity to manipulate it, in which case you're not changing, you are influencing the thing as it was being produced in the past. So some quantum event is producing a random bit.
Hmm.
So you can influence that when it was being created. And you happen to be in the future when you're doing that, but that seems to be okay in this effect. So I would say then that when you think about the nature of mind influencing and interacting with reality, with the physical reality that everyone experiences, uh, provided that there are things in the past which are not yet known,
Hmm.
we can influence it now.
Makes me think of, I read many years ago Michael Talbot's Holographic Universe, which you mentioned in Science of Magic, and I believe it was in Entangled Minds, you may mention it as well.
Yeah,
And just talking about that the universe itself not like a hologram. And I go back to something I experienced when I was this was I made a decision I wanted to become plant-based. And it was I say I made the decision, but in fact I was walking home one day and it came to me as clear as day to stop eating beef and pork.
hmm.
And in that moment, I made the decision. I just walked past a McDonald's. So my mind said, stop eating beef and pork. I made that decision and I have never gone back. 10 years later, I stopped eating seafood and fowl. And so I remember that I look at just now what we know about processed foods and what we know about the significant consumption, particularly in the West here, of meat and the substances that are injected into the meat system to be able to produce and grow and like. I often wonder in what ways have I prevented myself from having particular experiences? I even go back to even before that, when I was 16 years old. I come home from work. I fell asleep crying, woke up crying, fell asleep crying, woke up crying. And this went on throughout the night. I wrote about this in my Substack a few months ago and said that in the middle of the night, an idea came to me. It says, I don't know why I'm going through this, but I'm going through it for a reason. It's only going to make me stronger and I will be okay in the long run. And when I read through Holographic Universe, I went back to those two experiences and I said, who's to say that in this moment of interfacing with that experience from that time, I'm not sending supportive energy back to that young man at the time because there was a feeling of peace the night I was falling asleep and waking up and falling asleep again crying. There
Mm.
was a feeling of certainty when the decision was made to both stop eating beef and pork and then subsequently seafood and fowl. There was a certainty there. And my wife and I have had similar experiences since we've been together 15 years now. And so it makes me wonder in what ways do we really impact the world around us? And we know that psi is real, and we know that it allows us to discover and cultivate these intrinsic capacities, which then leads me to this next question of what does this imply about human potential, especially for cultivating attention, intention, and inner stillness, not just for the individual, but the impact on those within the environment. What does Psi have to say about that?
Well, it says that separation is an illusion. So
Yeah.
we feel isolated, we're embodied, and so we're stuck in the body. At
Hmm.
least we feel that way, but it's an illusion.
Hmm.
An illusion in the sense that not to say that it isn't real, but it's not quite as real as we think it is.
Hmm.
So if you happen to be in a vicinity of people who are meditating and blissing out, you are much more likely to feel like you're blissed out, or at least happy. Uh, it's not clear to me that that distance actually matters at all
Yeah.
in these cases. Uh, but at least, as you well know, and then and the TM groups have done tests to see whether or not a local meditating group will somehow change crime rates in the
Yeah.
vicinity where they're
Yep.
actually quite far away from the other people. And the
Hmm.
answer seems to be yes.
Hmm.
And the Global Consciousness Project, which has random number generators around the world, shows something like that as well
Hmm.
globally. So this is actually an important point where, from a scientific perspective, we're interested in the basic existential question: does psi exist?
Yeah.
Like, is it a thing? Well, yeah,
Hmm.
I'm convinced it's a thing.
Yeah.
The very next question typically is, well, what good is it? So if it's a thing, especially in the laboratory, we tend to see pretty small effects. What
Hmm.
good is it then? Who cares? There's a lot of reasons why this as a radically different way of thinking about who we are and our role in society and the role in the physical world itself.
Hmm.
So we have a lot more agency as individuals and as groups than are we typically are taught.
I agree with you completely, and you addressed my next two questions in the statement, so I will go beyond those questions. For me, then the next question becomes, as we begin to embrace psi or magic, as we begin to understand that it has always been with us and we've always been a part of it, we've never been apart from it, what does that then say about the social structures, the constructs that we create? And do you see, for want of a better way of saying it, a radical restructuring of the social structures, of the ways in which we interface with one another, and the building and maintaining of society itself? I go back to looking at what happened when the USSR collapsed. And Jeffrey Sachs went over there and they used eggs to determine how people were feeling about the economy as it was moving forward. I love that story that he shares often. And when I see here in this case America for this discussion, how the mind oftentimes is manipulated by what we see in the media, be it social media or the dominant form of the media. I
Sure.
often wonder who's benefiting from what's being put out here and from what are people being diverted from in terms of capacities and possibilities. So, what do you see as psi or magic becomes much more widely understood in its right sense and not dramatic shifts, but those subtle things we recognize within the research? What does that mean long term?
Well, I think first of all, you follow the money whenever you're looking for why is advertising the way it is and why is the civilization structured the way it is. It's somewhat different in each culture,
Hmm.
but nevertheless, there's always, especially in the United States, you see everything is profit oriented. It's written into the law. You
Yeah.
have to produce profit. That automatically is going to say it's actually not that great for people because
Mm.
people then become a commodity, and the whole notion of what we're supposed to do is extract money from them. Well, so that's why there's a lot of sadness and depression that goes on because people eventually feel
Mm.
trapped
Yeah.
into it. There's a lot
Yeah.
that is like McDonald's is a good example. McDonald's spends a huge amount of money to make food that tastes really, really good. Is
Yeah.
it really, really good for you? That's a debatable question. Probably not if that's all that you have. But nevertheless, it's an example of the goal there is to provide fast food, but at a profit. It has to make profit. The worst case is in healthcare. Like
Mm.
the US has really, really horrible healthcare as compared to other similar nations because it's profit oriented.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So what does Psi have to do with this? Well, if we got to a point where more and more people recognize that not only do these phenomena exist, but that they are able to do it.
Hmm.
And especially if it involves something like telepathy.
Yes.
Well, with telepathy, you suddenly the whole business world, the justice world, politics, everything would completely collapse because it depends on not telling people the whole truth.
Yeah.
In some case, not telling them the truth at all.
Yeah.
So if everybody knew that, they would just watch somebody, some politician spouting something, and everyone he knew he's lying. Well, that would change things. It
Yeah.
would it's not clear to me that what would happen as a result, because part of the engine of society is to act. I mean, literally, the word governing is to govern it.
To
It's to
govern.
control and keep it stable.
Hmm.
And so it's the stability of a civilization, which is important because it allows people to figure out what they want to do next.
Yeah.
And if there was just total chaos, nobody knows what to do. And we see this happening in the United States now, that the
Hmm.
business doesn't know what to invest in, and the monetary system is in chaos because of the lack of stability.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have something as radical as a way of a lot of people suddenly becoming way more sensitive to others,
Hmm.
recognizing that we're not actually that separate.
Hmm.
Literally, we're not separate at all, but at least at the first step. That would ultimately change civilization. I would like to think that it would change it in a positive direction. Like we would actually finally be unified and
Hmm.
recognize what's good for me is good for all, and vice
Yeah.
versa. It would take time for that to happen. And I don't know whether it'd be more chaos in the interim or less chaos or whatever, but I see it actually as that is the direction that evolution is pushing us. We will
I,
eventually get there.
I agree with you. It makes me think of Yuval Noah Harari and others' discussion of Homo noeticus
Yes.
and how, as we evolve as humans, we begin to recognize the psi or magic or spiritual or the consciousness element that is the substrate of all. And as we come to, I gave a talk on campus a few years ago that talked about how the religions or life systems are pointing to this fundamental aspect. And as we become much more aware of it and enact it in our lives, who is it? Rumi says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I believe he's talking about consciousness. He says, I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, think transcending here, The world is too full to talk about. Ideas, languages, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. And so at that point, when you have this, for want of a better way of saying it, this magical experience, this mystical moment, going back to William James, you start realizing, oh, I'm a part of this. I've never been a part from it. And then the question becomes a responsibility that we have. And this is why I believe that as you continue to walk this path and this awakening occurs, as you talked about in the science of magic, it's not about having the money unless you want to use it to do something really good in terms of winning the lottery. It's about actually affecting some changes positively. This goes back to something I read in either Brother of the Third Degree by Will Garver or Secret of the Flames, talked about the importance of cultivating a life that you would allow you as you walk this path to do this work, where you have the necessary resources. You talked about how one of the grants that you had acquired and needed $25,000 and how you had the intention to secure that $25,000 because your colleague was no longer be able to participate and provide the services for that particular research project, but you were able to secure the $25,000. But that highlights that we have this capacity within. And it wasn't for you about having the money to go buy some inane thing. It was about creating, a body of literature and research that subsequent generations would have access to then chip away at the calcifications of our socially constructed minds that cause us to believe in separation as opposed to unity. And so I believe that those of us who choose to walk this path and move in that direction, it becomes less about having money for our comfort per se, although Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it becomes more about the ability, the capacity to create structures and models and frameworks that will outlive us, that we then bequeath to the world. And this is why when the opportunity to meet with you when we were over at Harvard on campus, to meet and talk with you, and it wasn't about I noticed my wife and I talked about this that day, that people were around you getting pictures. And I was not intrigued in the pictures. And your wife was kind enough to get a picture of us. But for me, it was about getting an opportunity to introduce myself and have a meaningful exchange and propose the opportunity to come on to the show. Because I believe, as Sadhguru said that night, we all have a responsibility when we have a platform, when we have the capacity to engage in a conversation, and in this case, create content that will outlive us, we have a responsibility to do so. And this is what I love about your research and your works, because when we transition from this place, all of this will be left behind for someone down the line to have access to. And that to me, I think is fascinating. So one other question, I have several questions here. I know we've gone over on our time. I apologize about that, but I get excited because to get an opportunity to speak with someone such as yourself, who's been doing this for 40 plus years, and when I proposed my research topic to my dissertation advisor, Fred Travis, he said it's an important dissertation. And so I look at having the opportunity to participate in an international conversation on consciousness, psi, magic, human potential. It's an honor. And so it's an honor to have you here. What I like to ask is, how have the last 4 decades for you, in terms of researching psi, how has it enhanced your life personally? I know what you've done professionally. I know how you've had the various experiences with the spoon, which I thought was a phenomenal experience. And I can only imagine what that was like for you to have that experience with the spoon. And how has it shifted your personal life? I met your wife, wonderful woman, by the way. How has it shifted your personal life?
Well, it's your question is similar to a question I often get, which is what's the most amazing psychic thing you've ever seen or
Mm,
witnessed? And my
mm,
answer is my career. So
mm,
I crafted something that doesn't exist, and I get questions from students all the time, like I like what you're doing. What do I do? How do I
mm,
do that?
mm,
And it's difficult to give an answer because there is no career path. You have to be an iconoclast from day one. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to withstand the risks involved in doing something like this. But so that's simply part of I came in that way. It's a trait that I have coming
mm,
from a family that mostly consisted of people creating unions, and fighting the strike the breakers and all that stuff. So there's a little bit of rebelliousness in there to begin with. But the main driver for me always has been curiosity. And
Mm.
the other thing, though, is that I found in working in conventional topics that I would get bored pretty quickly. Like if there was already a lot known about something and you're being like a technician and just pushing, like especially like publishing papers for the sake of getting a promotion or something, I found that so utterly boring and, in a sense, a waste of the very precious time that we have when we're able to do anything. Like, why would
Yes.
you want to spend your time doing that? Well, the answer is if you have responsibilities to others, and
Mm.
this is your job, and you have to do that because that's honorable. Okay.
Hmm.
Well, I don't have those responsibilities. So, in some respects, I'm being selfish because I'm doing what I personally want to do. I'm being driven.
Mm.
And I actually feel oftentimes it's not really a question of whether I want to do this. I
Mm.
feel like this is why I am here. This is what
Yes.
I'm doing because that's why I showed up this time. So before we were talking about like what the notion of separation as an illusion, and one of my
Mm.
favorite sayings on that was from Ramana Maharshi, who
Yes.
his students would ask him, how should we treat others?
There are no others.
There are no others.
There are no others. Yes.
I
It's one
love
of my
that.
favorites from him as well. One
Yeah.
of my favorites as well. And it just it highlights how, we're entangled. And to your book, Entangled Minds, Real Magic and the Science of Magic, and even Supernormal, because these capacities exist within us. They've always been there. But our socialization and acculturation often teach us differently. And for those who come to this information for the first time, perhaps via this discussion, if someone wanted to cultivate psi, where should they begin?
Learn to meditate.
Here, here.
That's the easy
Here.
way. If you want the hard way, which also works, but it will blast you into it whether you like it or not, it's psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That gets into when you talked about that in the science of magic, that and when I read that part, I went back to DeRope's work, where he talks about, when we engage in the taking of psychotropic substances, we're engaging in spiritual burglary, which again, we have the capacity to do this and cultivate it without taking of the substances. And I love how you talked about you don't advocate for jumping naked out of an airplane. You don't advocate for taking of substances. You want to take the road that will cultivate it naturally, which is via meditation.
Yeah.
And every meditation tradition has its value. And this is where I think I scoff when I hear people say this meditation is better than that one. And I'm just kind of like, okay, meditation has its value. It does something different within the brain. I know Fred, for a number of years, I don't know where this research stands, but they were looking to understand the different, how the different meditation modalities and what aspects of life they impact, to be able to, if a person wanted to have a specific experience or an outcome,
Mhm.
to engage in this particular meditation. But I think the big thing there is we've always had the capacity. And so I'm glad you said that in terms of meditation. So speaking of meditation, how long have you been meditating, and what was your first or even current form of meditation practice?
Well, the very first was TM when I was an undergraduate.
Hmm.
Uh, the what I encountered very quickly after learning TM was strange distortions in perception and things like that,
Hmm.
and time as well.
Hmm.
And at the time, they had checkers who were already more advanced.
Hmm.
And I learned afterwards, like by 2 weeks. So they didn't really know I would say, well, I'm getting these weird experiences. It's not very comfortable, like visual distortions and stuff. Well, what does it mean? What do I do?
Hmm.
They didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I stopped for quite a long time and then picked
Hmm.
it up again with mindfulness and a whole bunch of other methods. I've tried many methods because you're right. If you're going to meditate, you probably do want to try a bunch of methods until one of them feels completely right.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then you'll continue doing that. Because otherwise, if you're finding that it's a struggle,
Yeah.
well, who wants to do that? Nobody wants to do that. But fortunately, there are enough different styles. And especially like all meditation does not require sitting quietly.
Yes.
There's movement
Yes.
meditation. There's all kinds of
Yes.
things that people can do. And there's always something that will resonate with the individual. So it doesn't really matter. I think all of those roads converge at some point. And yeah, and the same is true even in the magical traditions that you want to achieve the state of gnosis, which
Hmm.
is essentially basically the same as samadhi in the
Yes.
yogic traditions.
I had an experience a few years ago. This was probably 4 years ago now. For several days, I kept hearing this particular beat that just kept in my head. And I, where I know this beat, where is it from? What's going on? And I was sitting in a meditation, and the name of this band popped into my head. And I was like, huh. At the time, I didn't own any of their music. I went online, Google, typed the name in. Two, well, a series of videos popped up. Two popped up. I clicked on the first one, listened to a few of the songs. The whole album was there. Not the one I was looking for. My wife called me to do something. The beat was still in my head. Several days. I go back to Google. I type the name in again. This time, same two websites came up. I clicked on the second one. The second one, first song, clicked on it. Boom. It was there. I said, that's the beat. So how did that happen? And it sat with me for quite some time to really just contemplate what occurred. Subsequent to that, I'm in an audiophile group because I collect vinyl. And it was announced that this one company from whom I, secured a lot of my vinyl from, they were releasing the whole series of their albums, on audiophile vinyl. And
Mm.
I immediately I went for it. And I share that story because, when you tap into this underlying field, Deepak Chopra talks about this in his book, Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, and how when he was being interviewed with Oprah, he said, you have access to all the knowledge, all the greats that came before you have access to. This gets into Rupert Sheldrake's works in terms of morphogenetic fields and how Roger Bannister rather did this in terms of the 4 minute mile. When you put that into that field of consciousness, that then allows everyone else who wants to tap into it to then have access to it.
Mhm.
And in that moment, that name of the band came up. I subsequent to that, learned who they were, purchased their music, and I have all of their albums. And I have them not as to a collector, although I am a collector, for that series, it's because of this impulse that came during a meditation, because I was able to get out of the way and allow that name to surface. And then somehow found out that someone was selling that series of albums, reproducing them at an audiophile quality, and I was able to secure the catalog. I'm sharing that only to say to those who will hear and, of this discussion and may want to, I think the term you use in the book called flapdoodle, that think of it as flapdoodle. It's not flapdoodle. It's real. We have the capacities latent within us. We simply have to get out of the way and stay out of the way and allow them to surface. Yes, we must do the work to cultivate it, find a tradition, find a technique, and cultivate it. We know, as you mentioned, the categories of meditations. You've got focused attention, open monitoring, and automatic self-transcending. All the meditations that have been peer reviewed fall into one of those three categories, and they produce different measurable effects within the brain itself. And so it's something I think that as we come to recognize, we've always had these capacities, that when we come across books like Supernormal, Entangled Minds, Real Magic, The Science of Magic, and we begin to study them, I look at your work and others' work as an invitation for us to study ourselves. And it's in studying ourselves we come to fully understand our capacities much more readily, actively engage in cultivating those capacities, and come to then serve as points of reference for not just those in our immediate realm, but also too for those who may hear of us. Because we may not change everybody, but we can change those around us and impact the world in measurable ways. And so I want to just say thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I want to encourage everyone to pick up your books. I'd say start immediately with The Science of Magic, which is the most recent, work that you introduce additional information into. I love how you talked about Masaru Emoto as well and the water experience.
Well, so Emoto came to our campus at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and gave a lecture on what he was doing, which was basically sending beautiful thoughts to water and then creating frozen crystals from the water and showing that, at least claiming that the water that was exposed to beautiful thoughts had beautiful crystals.
Hmm.
And either controlled water or water that was exposed to the opposite, to negative thoughts, either didn't produce any crystal at all or produced a sort of a mal-shaped crystal. So after his talk, I went up to him and said, would you be interested in a double-blind experiment? Because he wasn't doing that. And of course, it opens the possibility that he was simply selecting examples that matched what he was looking for. And he immediately said, sure, we would do that. So we did the intention on water, and then we sent bottles of our intention water along with controls, which were water from the same source but no intention, to his laboratory in Tokyo. And he invited me to go to Tokyo and to watch how they prepared this. But it was a walk-in freezer, and it was December, and I didn't want to go to Tokyo and stay a week in a freezer watching things happen. So I said, no, you won't know which bottle is which. Just have your technician take the pictures like he normally does, and then send us all of those pictures without knowing what the condition was. So that's the way we did a first experiment. We did a follow-up experiment under triple blind conditions. So that not only they didn't know and we didn't know, the analyst didn't know, it was tightly controlled. And we had hundreds of people then do the analysis of how beautiful is this crystal by putting it on a website. And so they had to give a range of numbers that this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen to this is not beautiful at all. Again, blinded. And so we finally do the whole analysis and we find that from a statistical perspective, we were able to replicate his claim that the intended water, the blessed water, looked better as crystals than the same water that was not blessed. So we thought, well, okay, that's kind of typical to what we would see in these experiments, that a claim that is not subject to the kind of control and rigor that you see in the laboratory is usually bigger. It's like things in the real world are bigger, and they have more important stuff. In the laboratory, we're intentionally squashing the phenomenon to get very high control over what's happening. But even in that condition, double and triple blind conditions, we still were able to see something. So it supported his notion that, yeah, water seems to be very reactive to intention and attention. And we've done a number of other studies involving water, which I think I mentioned in the book.
Yes, you'd have. And I have to say, again, when I look back over my life, looking at your work and the work of, again, J.B. Ryan going back to Duke parapsychology, and, just along the way, the various statements that have been made by Planck and Wigner and a host of others, I have to say it's incredibly encouraging to have someone such as yourself out here doing this work, you and your team at Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I am grateful that I took it upon myself and presented an opportunity to be on campus for the Sadhguru talk, that I was able to be there and to participate in the conference as well, and that we had an opportunity to meet and speak. And that led us to be in this moment today. So I want to encourage listeners to pick up your latest book, The Science of Magic. Then, of course, go to Real Magic, Entangled Minds, and Supernormal. And you may visit deanradin.com to view the other works as well. And I'd encourage people to begin to tap into the potential that rests latent within all of us, to begin to allow us to live much more full, much more beneficial lives, not just for ourselves, but also for those around us, to greater and greater effect. And with that, Dr. Dean Radin, thank you for being here today with me on Transcendence.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.